When I'm at an idea stage, I tend to write down ideas with paper, pencil, or pen and pencil. In fact, I have like whole, I didn't get them up, but I have lots of piles and piles of ideas. I have more ideas than I can ever write up. I have lots of idea books, and I have found that I carry around notebooks with me, and I have an idea notebook in my bedroom because sometimes you get a really good idea before you go to sleep. And then interestingly, when you wake up, sometimes you have no idea what that meant, but it's kind of funny that the idea that comes, they come from all over the place because once you start thinking like a writer and you start paying attention to things in your environment, any sort of little thing can be an idea. I'm actually working on a collaborative cookbook with my dad, and I'm working on the recipes and he's working on the stories. So I had to work on an introduction for the cookbook. And to start that process, I used pen and paper also and did sort of a brainstorming web where I put my grandma's name in the middle. And then I was trying to think of things that I remembered about her cooking in the kitchen, and this is the process I started to think about writing the introduction for that book, and then I went ahead and used my notes from here and here on the computer. So it's the first process is just sort of messy and creative and just real fluid thought process, and lots of people call this brainstorming or webs or circle maps or any sort of thing that sort of gets your mind flowing and gets your ideas going. And I also keep a sort of a notebook of what I do in writing every day, and I write down what I've done. And some people, I know some authors write down how many words they accomplish in a day, and just to keep track. And it's sort of my way to keep track of correspondence with people I need to write to, or if I'm giving a book talk, if I have emailed and responded back to them, or it's sort of just a way to keep track. And I like the idea of doing it with paper and pencil instead of on the computer. But most of my actual writing I do on the computer, just because it's just so nice to copy and paste and delete and save drafts. And actually every day on the computer that I work on a draft, I rename it and put the new date, so then I can see how many times I've worked on it and how many revisions there have been, and I know which revision came from where. And I usually, if I change and revise a story based on someone's comments, then I put that person's name there so I know what changes were made. The hardest thing about writing for me is just getting started. And I have to say that a lot of my students, I know they feel the same way. The first time through, I've heard people say that you write your first draft with your heart and that you revise with your head later. So the first draft, it's really supposed to be your writing, and you need to put away the inner judge, the person, the little voice inside your head that's saying, that doesn't make sense, or that word's not spelled right, or this is a fragmented sentence. And I actually try not to pay attention to what the computer's telling me either. So unfortunately, in Word, it underlines things and shows you where things are wrong, but I really try not to pay attention to that the first time through and just keep writing. The other thing that's really hard for me is finding where the real story is. And I'm trying to work on this with my class also. I teach second grade, and they like to tell beginning of the day stories to the end of the day. I'm doing a story that I worked with a student last year. He didn't like writing. He said, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. This is too hard. I don't have any good stories. And I said, what did you do this weekend? So it went like this. When I got up in the morning, my dad and I got into the car. We went to the mall, and I bought a pair of tennis shoes. Then we got a snack at the food court, and we went home, and we had dinner, and we went to bed. And so I remember talking to him, looking at this whole story, and I was trying to figure out, is he really writing about himself and his father? And so I said, is this about you and your father? And he said, no, I got shoes. And I said, oh, it's about the shoes. And I said, tell me about these shoes. And so then that was where the story was. So we pulled that little piece out, and he started telling me about his shoes. He was wearing them, and I said, well, they look pretty cool. I said, why do you like them? And he said, I can jump. And he just stopped like that. And he said, I can jump, and I can jump really high. And I said, you don't think you could jump as high before? And he said, no. And that's what the story was about. So then we sort of started writing that, and I said, why don't you write about that? Write about your shoes. And he drew a picture and wrote some sentences, and it turned out great. So for me, I have the same trouble he did, that sometimes when you're writing, you end up writing, and the theme of the story is someplace buried in the middle, and then you pull that out and that's your story. I never really know when I'm done. When I was working on the one-room school book and I was looking at the page proofs, and you have to do a line item check with your copy on the computer, and I would find a little tiny mistake and just go, oh my gosh, there's a mistake. So if there's that little teeny tiny thing that probably no one will ever see, there must be something else. And I just remember thinking, I wonder if there's something else that I said wrong, and it was nothing that the copy editor person did wrong. It was something that I had missed. It was a name that I didn't correct the first time through. So the editors and the copy editors had done their job, and it was something that I just missed until that last point. So it's hard for me to give it up. So the best thing about writing for me is that it's so much fun. Once you're going, and even the struggle, I do have a point when I'm just stuck, and then I just get up and walk away and do something else for a while. But then I know it's sort of like you're still writing in your head. So I will get up and go do something fun with my husband. We'll go kayaking, or we'll go work in the garden. And in my head, if you just let your head rest for a little bit, it is working itself out, and I end up figuring out what I was struggling about. And that is really fun, because all of a sudden the thought goes off in your head, and you're like, that's the answer. I can't wait to get back to my writing. There's a real emotional side to writing that is just beneficial. That for some kids, if there's something that they are struggling with, or a problem they need to solve, or something they don't quite understand, or a conversation they had with a student that didn't go the way they thought, that sometimes if you write about it or draw about it, it sort of helps you to figure it out. Here's my writing advice. I have been thinking that in school, when teachers are teaching science, it's generally always taught as a process, and you wonder about something and ask a question, and then you make a hypothesis, and you do your experiments, and you think about it, and you write about it, and you do your lab reports, and then you come to some sort of a conclusion. And I think everybody's really okay with thinking, yes, science is a process like that kind of experiment. And so in math, it's a process also, where we might not get the same answer the same way, and it's fun to compare answers and ideas and what did you do to figure that out. But for some reason in writing, there are still kids who don't see that writing is a process that's hard and it takes time. They just think that they need to get the words right, or they need to spell the words right, and then turn it in and be done. And I like to think that writing is also a kind of a process, and that you learn to respect and understand and appreciate and sort of wallow in the process is something that's really fun, because that's what writing is. Everybody that I've ever said to be a good writer is to read. Students don't really understand what that means. They just say, well, you should read more, read. And then I've had kids say, well, what do you mean I should read more? And I feel like there is some explanation needed there, because if you're going to read like a writer, you need to be reading and noticing more than just the beginning, middle, and the end of the story. You really need to be noticing the author's viewpoint and the author's style, and there's so much more to reading a book than just understanding what's happening.